There will be spoilers ahead for All the Sinners Bleed by S.A. Cosby. If you haven't read it, highly recommend you do. Do keep in mind it's a very dark book. The protagonist is a sheriff, Titus Crown, and he's trying to uphold justice in a world that seems beyond that, at least in how he describes it. The antagonist, on the other hand, has done some unspeakable things that are very hard to read about. Now, these two guys have very, very little in common, except for one key belief. Both see God as indifferent, and I think that's where things get interesting. Let's talk about Gnosticism. It emerged around the 2nd century and was quickly deemed heretical, heresy, and by the 6th century it had completely disappeared as like an organized movement. There are some secret groups that have kept it alive. The core belief is, in my opinion, very bleak. Gnosticism thinks that the God that we worship, what we call God, is a demiurge, or a lesser god, a fake god, that sort of deceives us into thinking that he's the ultimate being. Behind him is the true ultimate being that's this incomprehensible entity that is completely unreachable for humanity, that is completely indifferent. Now, the demiurge, from what I understand, is also either completely indifferent or kind of malicious, and both of these characters in the book seem to believe in something at least similar to this. The main antagonist was horrifically abused throughout his whole childhood, at the point where he realizes that all of this suffering is random. He concludes that God has to be indifferent. Titus, on the other hand, has witnessed firsthand truly unthinkable evil, especially with this case. And that also leads him to the conclusion that there might not be a God, but if there is one, he is indifferent, because if this was all planned, then it's just malicious. And obviously, both of these guys have gone through very traumatic events, and you can't really compare that suffering. But what you can compare is that fundamental underlying belief that they both reached. Both men believe in this indifferent God, but they act upon this belief in such different ways. Titus, with all of his order, is almost trying to rebel against that indifferent God, almost as if to say that if you won't create true justice, then I have to at least make the attempt. Our antagonist does the opposite. He embraces the chaos almost to prove that this is how things are. He's trying to prove God's indifference by creating as much suffering as he can. And I think it's just another really cool layer about this book. It's not just good versus evil. It's how the same fundamental belief can be interpreted into very different ways. And even beyond that, like if you look at it through a Gnostic lens, then the question, I think, is if God actually is indifferent, then is it our responsibility to make things better, or does it not matter? I think if I were to believe in that, I were to agree with Titus more, for sure. But it's still a pretty interesting question.